Hello there. Welcome to the Adventure and Mystery Book Club. I'm Bill Mallory, branch manager of the La Jolla Library, and I'm so glad that you could join me for today's reading of Captain Blood. Captain Blood, a pirate story, not to reveal too much too soon. And we're going to be reading chapters 3 and 4 today. Just to briefly talk about the chapters, our first two chapters, chapters 1 and 2, that we read on Friday. Um, Two chapters in, and we're already filled with a lot of good action and adventure. We have been introduced to a medical man by the name of Peter Blood, living a quiet life after having been a military man and fought in several wars for several sides. He decides to get his medical degree, and he settles down into the first small city that he lands in, and was going to live his life, basically live his life in a quiet way as much as he can. Well, circumstances have other plans, and the situation that happens here is actually a true story. And Rafeal Sabatini, the author, kind of folded this story within the actual true story. And if you didn't pick up on what was going on, basically here's a rundown. So in England, you have King Charles II, and he has died, and there is another man by the name of James Scott, and he is said to be the illegitimate son of King Charles, and that he is throughout his life has been given uh, military positions. He was head of some I want to say Cambridge, head of Cambridge, but it was some university. He has gotten successive increases in responsibility, mostly through in the military. He is very popular among among the people, the just the folks who live in you know not the nobility so much, because he's illegitimate. Um, and in fact, if you remember the reading on Friday, there's actually a point at which the author, the narrator, says that even his paternity is in question. They're hinting that he may not even be uh, King Charles's illegitimate child, but that he is in fact just someone who's trying to uh, con everybody into thinking that for his own gain. So anyway, uh, the real story is that he is later named the Duke of Monmouth, and his name is from that point on is Monmouth, and everyone sort of calls him Monmouth, and that is what they call him in this story as well. So here he is. He has a burgeoning military career. He's doing quite well for himself. He's got the popularity of the people behind him. And when King Charles dies, um, the throne is going to go to his brother, King James, or who will be King James, and he but Monmouth actually uh, supports his right to the throne. That as the firstborn child of King Charles, that it really should be him who should be on the throne instead. And so what happens is in real life, the real history is that he sets forth and basically with three ships filled with soldiers goes in and uh, fights the regular military, the army, to support his claim for regency, and he fails horribly. I mean, really bad when you compare the soldiers that he's got on his side to the regular army. Much better equipped, uh, better trained. He fails, badly, and he is. There's a whole story. It's actually kind of interesting because in the real story, he escapes. He hides runs away from the search parties. They're trying to find him for many days. He is later found calling for help, stuck in a bramble bush, and that he hasn't had a chance to eat or drink anything for the last few days. He's not looking, very healthy. They pull him out of the bramble bush. He is immediately arrested. He pleads for his life with King James and his uncle, and who in turn says, "Nope, prepare to die." And Monmouth is beheaded, and that's the end of him. So the story that we are seeing here is that a the battle is going on. The people are supporting Monmouth. So the nephew of the two old women who live across the street from Peter Blood send him to go get help from Mr. Blood. They don't call him Dr. Blood, but I guess because he doesn't have a doctorate. But um, and they take him to this noble's house and to help one of the soldiers, one of the leaders of the lords who was supporting Monmouth and who has been wounded. So he goes there to help this man, only to have the army, who is searching again for traitors, find them, realize that they are supporting the wrong side, basically, and they're shown off as a kind of a bunch of roughnecks, uncouth, coarse. It's implied that after they leave, they treat the women who are left at the house badly. They don't go into detail. The only thing you hear is that one of the women screams as these arrested men are being taken away. And of course, Peter Blood, for having helped a supporter of Monmouth, is arrested as a traitor. The Lord is arrested, and the man who owns the house is arrested, and the young nephew who called for his help in the first place is also arrested. And that's where it ended. So we can see that in the real framework of this historical event, Rafeal Sabatini has written this character who's kind of stuck in this unfortunate situation of doing his duty as a doctor and helping this person who has been injured, and so he did, and now the uncouth and the uneducated army men are now just gathering everybody up, and really what they're saying is they wanted to kill, if not all of them, most of them, maybe not the Lord, but everyone else. They wanted to just kill right there and just be done with it. But Peter Blood is able to kind of talk them out of it, and they are instead sent over for trial. And that's where the first two chapters end. So, a very exciting first two chapters, as our main hero has gotten himself into a bit of a pickle. So, if you are ready, tomorrow's Facebook post, I'll post a little bit more about Monmouth, and you can kind of see a picture of him, and you can kind of get an overview of the actual historical the true part of this in amidst the fiction. But as we start, we're going to begin chapter 3, which is entitled "The Lord Chief Justice." It was not until 2 months later, on the 19th of September, if you must have the actual date, that Peter Blood was brought to trial upon the charge of high treason. We know that he was not guilty of this, but we need not doubt that he was quite capable of it by the time he was indicted. Those 2 months of inhuman, unspeakable imprisonment had moved his mind to a cold and deadly hatred of King James and his representatives. It says something for his fortitude that in all the circumstances he should still have had a mind at all. Yet, terrible as it was, the position of this entirely innocent man, he had cause for thankfulness on two counts. The first of these was that he should have been brought to trial at all. The second, that his trial took place on the date named and not a day earlier. In the very delay which exacerbated him lay, although he did not realize it, his only chance of avoiding the gallows. Easily, but for the favor of fortune, he might have been one of those haled on the morrow of battle, more or less haphazard from the overflowing jail at Bridgewater, to be summarily hanged in the market-place by the bloodthirsty Colonel Kirke. There was about the colonel of the Tangiers regiment a deadly dispatch which might have disposed in like fashion of all those prisoners, numerous as they were, but for the vigorous intervention of Bishop Muse, which put an end to the drumhead court-martial. Even so, in that first week after Sedgemoor, Kirke and Feversham contrived between them to put to death over 100 men after a trial so summary as to be no trial at all. They required human freights for the gibbets, with which they were planting the countryside, and they little cared how they procured them or what innocent lives they took. What, after all, was the life of a clod? The executioners were kept busy with rope and chopper and cauldrons of pitch. I spare you the details of that nauseating picture. It is, after all, with the fate of Peter Blood that we are concerned, rather than with that of the Monmouth rebels. He survived to be included in one of those melancholy droves of prisoners who, chained in pairs, were marched from Bridgewater to Taunton. Those who were too sorely wounded to march were conveyed in carts, into which they were brutally crowded, their wounds undressed and festering. Many were fortunate enough to die upon the way. When Blood insisted upon his right to exercise his art so as to relieve some of this suffering, he was accounted importunate and threatened with a flogging. If he had one regret now, it was that he had not been out with Monmouth. That, of course, was illogical, but you could hardly expect logic from a man in his position. His chain companion was that on that dreadful march was the same Jeremy Pitt, who had been the agent of his present misfortunes. The young shipmaster had remained his close companion after their common arrest. Hence, fortuitously, had they been chained together in the crowded prison, where they were almost suffocated by the heat and the stench during those days of July, August, and September. Scraps of news filtered into the jail from the outside world. Some may have been deliberately allowed to penetrate. Of these was the tale of Monmouth's execution. It created profoundest dismay among those men who were suffering for the Duke and for the religious cause he had professed to champion. Many refused utterly to believe it. A wild story began to circulate that a man resembling Monmouth had offered himself up in the Duke's stead, and that Monmouth survived to come again in glory to deliver Zion and make a war upon Babylon. Mr. Blood heard that tale with the same indifference with which he had received the news of Monmouth's death. But one shameful thing he heard in connection with this which left him not quite so unmoved, and served to nourish the contempt he was forming for King James. His Majesty had consented to see Monmouth. To have done so unless he intended to pardon him was a thing execrable and damnable beyond belief. For the only other object in granting that interview could be the evilly mean satisfaction of spurning the abject penitence of his unfortunate nephew. Later they heard that Lord Grey, who, after the Duke, indeed, perhaps before him, was the main leader of the rebellion, had purchased his own pardon for £40,000. Peter Blood found this apiece with the rest. His contempt for King James blazed out at last. "Why, here's a filthy mean creature to sit on a throne. If I had known as much of him before as I do today, I don't doubt I should have given cause to be where I am now." And then, on a sudden thought, "And where will Lord Gildoy be, do you suppose?" he asked. Young Pitt, whom he addressed, turned towards him a face from which the ruddy tan of the sea had faded almost completely during those months of captivity. His gray eyes were round and questioning. Blood answered him. "Sure now we've never seen his lordship since that day at Oglethorpe's. And where are the other gentry that were taken, the real leaders of the plaguey rebellion? Gray's case explains their absence, I think. They were wealthy men and can ransom themselves. Here awaiting the gallows are none but the unfortunates who followed those who had the honor to lead them go free. It's a curious and instructive reversal of the usual way of things. Faith, it's an uncertain world entirely." He laughed, and settled down into that spirit of scorn, wrapped in which he stepped later into the great hall of Taunton Castle to take his trial. With him went Pitt and the yeoman Baines. The three of them were to be tried together, and their case was to open the proceedings of that ghastly day. The hall, even to the galleries, thronged with spectators, most of whom were ladies, was hung in scarlet, a pleasant conceit, this, of the Lord Chief Justice's, who naturally enough preferred the color that should reflect his own bloody mind. At the upper end, on a raised dais, sat the Lords Commissioners, the 5 judges in their scarlet robes and heavy dark periwigs, Baron Jeffreys of Wem enthroned in the middle place. The prisoners filed in under guard. The crier called for silence under pain of imprisonment, and the hum of voices gradually became hushed. Mr. Blood considered with interest the 12 good men and true that composed the jury. Neither good nor true did they look. They were scared, uneasy, and hangdog as any set of thieves caught with their hands in the pockets of their neighbors. They were 12 shaken men, each of whom stood between the sword of the Lord Chief Justice, recent bloodthirsty charge, and the wall of his own conscience. From them, Mr. Blood's calm, deliberate glance passed on to consider the Lords Commissioners, and particularly the presiding judge, that Lord Jeffreys, whose terrible fame had come ahead of him from Dorchester. He beheld a tall, slight man on the young side of 40, with an oval face that was delicately beautiful. There were dark stains of suffering or sleeplessness under the low-lidded eyes, highlighting their brilliance and their gentle melancholy. The face was very pale, save for the vivid color of the full lips and the hectic flush on the rather high but inconspicuous cheekbones. It was something in those lips that marred the perfection of that countenance. A fault, elusive but undeniable, lurked there to belie the fine sensitiveness of those nostrils, the tenderness of those dark, liquid eyes, and the noble calm of that pale brow. The physician in Mr. Blood regarded the man with peculiar interest, knowing as he did the agonizing malady from which his lordship suffered, and the amazingly irregular, debauched life that he had led in spite of it, perhaps because of it. Peter Blood, hold up your hand. Abruptly he was recalled to his position by the harsh voice of the clerk of arraigns. His obedience was mechanical, and the clerk droned out the wordy indictment which pronounced Peter Blood a false traitor against the most illustrious and most excellent Prince James II, by the grace of God of England, Scotland, France, and Ireland King, his supreme and natural lord. It informed him that, having no fear of God in his heart, but being moved and seduced by the instigation of the devil, he had failed in his love and true and due natural obedience towards his said lord the king, and had moved to disturb the peace and tranquillity of the kingdom, and to stir up war and rebellion, to depose his said lord the king from the title, honor, and the regal name of the imperial crown. And much more of the same kind, at the end of all of which he was invited to say whether he was guilty or not guilty. He answered more than was asked. It's entirely innocent I am. A small, sharp-faced man at a table before and to the right of him bounced up. It was Mr. Pollexfen, the judge advocate. Are you guilty or not guilty? Snapped this peppery gentleman. You must take the words. Words, is it? Said Peter Blood. Oh, not guilty. And he went on, addressing himself to the bench. On this same subject of words, may it please your lordships, I am guilty of nothing to justify any of those words I have heard used to describe me, unless it be of a want of patience at having been closely confined for 2 months and longer in a fetid jail with great peril to my health and even life. Being started, he would have added a deal more, but at this point the Lord Chief Justice interposed in a gentle, rather plaintive voice. Look you, sir, because we must observe the common and usual methods of trial, I must interrupt you now. You are no doubt ignorant of the forms of law. Not only ignorant, my lord, but hitherto most happy in that ignorance. I could gladly have foregone this acquaintance with them. A pale smile momentarily lightened the wistful countenance. I believe you. You shall be fully heard when you come to your defense, but anything you say now is altogether irregular and improper. Enheartened by that apparent sympathy and consideration, Mr. Blood answered thereafter, as was required of him, that he would be tried by God and his country. Whereupon, having prayed to God to send him a good deliverance, the clerk called upon Andrew Baines to hold up his hand and plead. From Baines, who pleaded not guilty, the clerk passed on to Pitt, who boldly owned his guilt. The Lord Chief Justice stirred at that. Come, that's better, quoth he, and his 4 scarlet brethren nodded. If all were as obstinate as his 2 fellow rebels, there would never be an end. After that ominous interpolation, delivered with an inhuman iciness that sent a shiver through the court, Mr. Pollexfen got to his feet. With great prolixity, he stated the general case against the 3 men and the particular case against Peter Blood, whose indictment was to be taken first. The only witness called for the king was Captain Hobart. He testified briskly to the manner in which he had found and taken the 3 prisoners, together with Lord Gildoy. Upon the orders of his colonel, he would have hanged Pitt out of hand, but was restrained by the lies of the prisoner Blood, who led him to believe that Pitt was a peer of the realm and a person of consideration. As the captain's evidence concluded, Lord Jeffreys looked across at Peter Blood. Will the prisoner ask the witness any questions? None, my lord. He has correctly related what occurred. I'm glad to have your admission of that without any of the prevarications that are usual in your kind. And I will say this, that here prevarication would avail you little, for we always have the truth in the end. Be sure of that. Baines and Pitt similarly admitted the accuracy of the captain's evidence, whereupon the scarlet figure of the Lord Chief Justice heaved a sigh of relief. This means so, let us get on, in God's name, for we have much to do. There was now no trace of the gentleness in his voice. It was brisk and rasping, and the lips through which it passed were curved in scorn. I take it, Mr. Pollexfen, that the wicked treason of these three rogues being established, indeed admitted by them, there is no more to be said. Peter Blood's voice rang out crisply on a note that almost seemed to contain laughter. May it please your lordship, but there is a deal more to be said. His lordship looked at him, first in blank amazement at his audacity, then gradually with an expression of dull anger. The scarlet lips fell into unpleasant, cruel lines that transfigured the whole countenance. How now, rogue? Would you waste our time with idle subterfuge? I would have your lordship and the gentlemen of the jury hear me on my defense, as your lordship promised that I should be heard. Why, so you shall, villain, so you shall. His lordship's voice was harsh as a file. He writhed as he spoke, and for an instant his features were distorted. A delicate, dead-white hand on which the veins showed blue brought forth a handkerchief with which he dabbed his lips and then his brow. Observing him with a physician's eye, Peter Blood judged him a prey to the pain of the disease that was destroying him. So you shall, but after the admission made, what defense remains? You shall judge, my lord. That is the purpose for which I sit here. And so shall you, gentlemen. Blood looked from judge to jury. The latter shifted uncomfortably under the confident flash of his blue eyes. Lord Geoffrey's bullying charge had whipped the spirit out of them. Had they themselves been prisoners accused of treason, he could not have arraigned them more ferociously. Peter Blood stood boldly forward, erect, self-possessed, and saturnine. He was freshly shaven, and his periwig, if out of curl, was at least carefully combed and dressed. Captain Hobart has testified to what he knows, that he found me at Oglethorpe's farm on the Monday morning after the battle at Weston, but he has not told you what I did there. Again the judge broke in. Why? What should you have been doing there in the company of rebels? Two of them, Lord Gildoy and your fellow there, have already admitted their guilt. That is what I beg leave to tell your lordship. I pray you do, and in God's name be brief, man, for I am to be troubled with the say of all you traitor dogs. I may sit here until the spring Assizes. I was there, my lord, in my quality as a physician, to dress Lord Gildoy's wounds. What's this? Do you tell us that you're a physician? A graduate of Trinity College, Dublin. Good God! Cried Lord Jeffreys, his voice suddenly swelling, his eyes upon the jury. What an impudent rogue is this! You heard the witness say that he had known him in Tangiers some years ago, and that he was then an officer in the French service. You heard the prisoner admit that the witness had spoken the truth. Why, so he had, yet what I'm telling you is also true, so it is. For some years I was a soldier, but before that I was a physician, and I have been one again since January last, established in Bridgewater, as I can bring 100 witnesses to prove. There's not the need to waste our time with that. I will convict you out of your own rascally mouth. I will ask you only this. How came you to represent yourself as a physician, peacefully following your calling in the town of Bridgewater, to be with the army of the Duke of Monmouth? I was never with that army. No witness has sworn to that, and I dare swear that no witness will. I never was attracted to the late rebellion. I regarded the adventure as a wicked madness. I take leave to ask your lordship, his brogue became more marked than ever, what should I, who was born and bred a papist, be doing in the army of the Protestant champion? A papist, thou? The judge gloomed on him a moment. Art more like a snivelling, canty Jack Presbyter. I tell you, man, I can smell a Presbyterian 40 miles. Then I'll take leave to marvel that with so keen a nose your lordship can't smell a papist at 4 paces. There was a ripple of laughter in the galleries, instantly quelled by the fierce glare of the judge and the voice of the crier. Lord Jeffreys leaned farther forward upon his desk. He raised that delicate white hand, still clutching its handkerchief, and sprouting a froth of lace. We'll leave your religion out of account for the moment, friend, said he. But mark what I say to you. With a minatory forefinger, he beat the time of his words. Know, friend, that there is no religion a man can pretend can give a countenance to lying. Thou hast a precious immortal soul, and there is nothing in the world equal to it in value. Consider that the great God of heaven and earth, before whose tribunal thou and we and all persons are to stand at that last day, will take vengeance on thee for every falsehood, and justly strike thee into eternal flames, make thee drop into the bottomless pit of fire and brimstone, if thou offer to deviate from the least from the truth, and nothing but the truth. For I tell thee, God is not mocked. On that, I charge you to answer truthfully. How came you to be taken with these rebels? Peter Blood gaped at him a moment in consternation. The man was incredible, unreal, fantastic, a nightmare judge. Then he collected himself to answer. I was summoned that morning to succor Lord Gildoy, and I conceived it to be the duty imposed upon me by my calling to answer that summons. Did you so? The judge, terrible now of aspect, his face white, his twisted lips red as the blood for which they thirsted, glared upon him in evil mockery. Then he controlled himself as if by effort. He sighed. He resumed his earlier gentle plaintiveness. Lord, how you waste our time! But I'll have patience with you. Who summoned you? Master Pitt there, as he will testify. Oh, Master Pitt will testify, he that is himself a traitor self-confessed. Is that your witness? There is also Master Baines here, who can answer to it. Good Master Baines will have to answer for himself, and I doubt not he'll be greatly exercised to save his own neck from a halter. Come, come, sir, are these your only witnesses? I could bring others from Bridgewater, who saw me set out that morning upon the crupper of Master Pitt's horse. His lordship smiled. It will not be necessary, for, mark me, I do not intend to waste more time on you. Answer me only this. When Mr. Pitt, as you pretend, came to summon you, did you know that he had been, as you have heard him confess, of Monmouth's following? I did, my lord. You did? Ha! His lordship looked at the cringing jury and uttered a short, stabbing laugh. Yet in spite of that you went with him. To succor a wounded man, as was my sacred duty. Thy sacred duty, sayest thou? Fury blazed out of him again. Good God, what a generation of vipers do we live in! Thy sacred duty, rogue, is to thy king and to God. But let it pass. Did he tell you whom it was that you were desired to succor? Lord Gildoy, yes. And you knew that Lord Gildoy had been wounded in the battle, and on what side he fought? I knew. And yet, being, as you would have us believe, a true and loyal subject of our lord the king, you went to succor him. Peter Blood lost patience for a moment. My business, my lord, was with his wounds, not with his politics. A murmur from the galleries, and even from the jury, approved him. It served only to drive his terrible judge into a deeper fury. Jesus God! Was there ever such an impudent villain in the world as thou? He swung white-faced to the jury. I hope, gentlemen of the jury, you take notice of the horrible carriage of this traitor rogue, and withal you cannot but observe the spirit of this sort of people. What a villainous and devilish one it is. Out of his own mouth he has said enough to hang him a dozen times. Yet is there more. Answer me this, sir. When you cozened Captain Hobart with your lies concerning the station of this other traitor Pitt, what was your business then? To save him from being hanged without trial, as was threatened. What concern was it of yours whether or how the wretch was hanged? Justice is the concern of every loyal subject, for an injustice committed by one who holds the king's commission is in some sense a dishonor to the king's majesty. It was a shrewd, sharp thrust aimed at the jury, and it reveals, I think, the alertness of the man's mind, his self-possession ever steadiest in the moments of dire peril. With any other jury, it might have made the impression that he had hoped to make. It may even have made the impression upon these poor pusillanimous sheep, but the dread judge was there to efface it. He gasped aloud, then flung himself violently forward. Lord of heaven, he stormed, was there ever such a canting, impudent rascal? But I have done with you. I see thee, villain. I see thee already, with a halter round thy neck. Having spoken so, gloatingly, evilly, he sank back again, and composed himself. It was as if a curtain fell. All emotion passed again from his pale face. Back to invest it again came that gentle melancholy. Speaking after a moment's pause, his voice was soft, almost tender, yet every word of it carried sharply through that hushed court. If I know my own heart, it is not in my nature to desire the hurt of anybody, much less to delight in his eternal perdition. It is out of compassion for you that I have used all these words, because I would have you have some regard for your immortal soul, and not ensure its damnation by obdurately persisting in falsehood and prevarication. But I see that all the pains in the world and all the compassion and charity are lost upon you, and therefore I will say no more to you. He turned again to the jury that countenance of wistful beauty. "Gentlemen, you must tell, I must tell you for law, of which we are the judges, not you, that if any person be in actual rebellion against the king and another person who really and actually was not in rebellion does knowingly receive harbor, comfort, or succor him, such a person is as much a traitor as he who indeed bore arms. We are bound by our oaths and consciences to declare to you what is law, and you are bound by your oaths and your consciences to deliver and to declare to us by your verdict the truth of the facts." Upon that, he proceeded his summing up, showing how Baines and Blood were both guilty of treason, the first for having harbored a traitor, and the second for having succored that traitor by dressing his wounds. He interlarded his address by sycophantic allusions to his natural lord and lawful sovereign, the king, whom God has set over them, and with vituperations of nonconformity, and of Monmouth, of whom, in his own words, he dared boldly affirm that the meanest subjects within the kingdom that was of legitimate birth had a better title to the crown. "Jesus God! That ever we should have such a generation of vipers among us!" he burst out in rhetorical frenzy, and then he sank back as if exhausted by the violence he had used. A moment he was still, dabbing his lips again. Then he moved uneasily. Once more his features were twisted by pain, and in a few snarling, almost incoherent words, he dismissed the jury to consider the verdict. Peter Blood had listened to the intemperate, the blasphemous, and almost obscene invective of that tirade with a detachment that afterwards, in retrospect, surprised him. He was so amazed by the man, by the reactions taking place in him between mind and body, and by his methods of bullying and coercing the jury into bloodshed, that he almost forgot that his own life was at stake. The absence of that dazed jury was a brief one. The verdict found the three prisoners guilty. Peter Blood looked round the scarlet-hung court. For an instant, that foam of white faces seemed to heave before him. Then he was himself again, and a voice was asking him what he had to say for himself, why sentence of death should not be passed upon him, being convicted of high treason. He laughed, and his laugh jarred uncannily among the deathly stillness of the court. It was all so grotesque, such a mockery of justice administered by that wistful-eyed jack-pudding in scarlet, who was himself a mockery, the venal instrument of a brutally spiteful and vindictive king. His laughter shocked the austerity of that same jack-pudding. "Do you laugh, sirrah, with the rope about your neck, upon the very threshold of that eternity you are so suddenly to enter into?" And then Blood took his revenge. "Faith, it's in better case I am for mirth than your lordship, for I have this to say before you deliver judgment. Your lordship sees me, an innocent man, whose only offense is that I practice charity with a halter round my neck. Your lordship, being the justicer, speaks with knowledge of what is to come to me. I, being a physician, may speak with knowledge of what is to come to your lordship. And I tell you that I would not now change places with you, that I would not exchange this halter that you fling about my neck for the stone that you carry in your body. The death to which you may doom me is a light pleasantry by contrast with the death to which your lordship has been doomed by the great judge with whose name your lordship makes so free. The Lord Chief Justice sat stiffly upright, his face ashen, his lips twitching, and whilst you might have counted 10, there was no sound in that paralyzed court after Peter Blood had finished speaking. All those who knew Lord Jeffreys regarded this as the lull before the storm, and braced themselves for the explosion. But none came. Slowly, faintly, the color crept back into that ashen face. The scarlet figure lost its rigidity and bent forward. His lordship began to speak, in a muted voice and briefly, much more briefly than his wont on such occasions, and in a manner entirely mechanical, the manner of a man whose thoughts are elsewhere while his lips are speaking. He delivered sentence of death in the prescribed form, and without the least allusion to what Peter Blood had said. Having delivered it, he sank back, exhausted, his eyes half closed, his brow agleam with sweat. The prisoners filed out. Mr. Pollexfen, a Whig at heart, despite the position of judge advocate which he occupied, was overheard by one of the jurors to mutter in the ear of a brother counsel, "On my soul, that swarthy rascal has given his lordship a scare. It's a pity he must hang, for a man who can frighten Jeffreys should go far." Chapter 4. Human Merchandise. Mr. Pollexfen was at one and the same time right and wrong, a condition much more common than is generally supposed. He was right in his indifferently expressed thought that a man whose mien and words could daunt such a lord of terror as Jeffreys could by the dominance of his nature be able to fashion himself a considerable destiny. He was wrong, though justifiably so, on his assumption that Peter Blood must hang. I have said that the tribulations with which he was visited as a result of his errand of mercy to the Oglethorpe's farm contained, although as yet he did not perceive it, perhaps, two sources of thankfulness. One, that he was tried at all; the other, that his trial took place on the 19th of September. Until the 18th, the sentences passed by the court of the Lords Commissioners had been carried out literally and expeditiously. But on the morning of the 19th there arrived at Taunton a courier from Lord Sunderland, the Secretary of State, with a letter for Lord Jeffreys, wherein he was informed that his Majesty had been graciously pleased to command that 1,100 rebels should be furnished for transportation to some of his Majesty's southern plantations, Jamaica, Barbados, or any of the Leeward Islands. You are not to suppose that this command was dictated in any sense by any sense of mercy. Lord Churchill was no more than just when he spoke of the king's heart as being as insensible as marble. It had been realized that in these wholesale hangings there was taking place a reckless waste of valuable material. Slaves were urgently required in the plantations, and a healthy, vigorous man could be reckoned worth at least from 10 to 15 pounds. Then there were at court many gentlemen who had some claim or other upon his Majesty's bounty. Here was a cheap and ready way to discharge these claims. From amongst the convicted rebels a certain number might be set aside to be bestowed upon those gentlemen, so as they might dispose of them to their own profit. My Lord Sunderland's letter gives precise details of the royal beneficence in human flesh. 1,000 prisoners were to be distributed among some 8 courtiers and others, whilst a postscriptum to his lordship's letter asked for a further 100 to be held at the disposal of the Queen. These prisoners were to be transported at once to His Majesty's southern plantations, and to be kept there for a space of 10 years before being restored to liberty. The parties to whom they were assigned entering into security to see that transportation was immediately effected. We know from Lord Jeffreys's secretary how the Chief Justice inveighed that night in drunken frenzy against this misplaced clemency to which His Majesty had been persuaded. We know how he attempted by letter to induce the king to reconsider his decision, but James adhered to it. It was, apart from the indirect profit he derived from it, a clemency full worthy of him. He knew that to spare lives in this fashion was to convert them into living deaths. Many must succumb in torment to the horrors of West Indian slavery, and so be the envy of their surviving companions. Thus it happened that Peter Blood, and with him Jeremy Pitt and Andrew Baines, instead of being hanged, drawn, and quartered as their sentences directed, were conveyed to Bristol, and there shipped with some 50 others aboard the Jamaica Merchant. From close confinement under hatches, ill nourishment, and foul water, a sickness broke out amongst them, of which 11 died. Amongst these was the unfortunate yeoman from Oglethorpe's farm, brutally torn from his quiet homestead amid the fragrant cider orchards, for no other sin but that he had practiced mercy. The mortality might have been higher than it was but for Peter Blood. At first the master of the Jamaica Merchant had answered with oaths and threats the doctor's expostulations against permitting men to perish in this fashion, and his insistence that he should be made free of the medicine chest and given leave to minister to the sick. But presently Captain Gardiner came to see that he might be brought to task for these 2 heavy losses of human merchandise, and because of this he was belatedly glad to avail himself of the skill of Peter Blood. The doctor went to work zealously and zestfully, and wrought so ably that by his ministrations and by improving the condition of his fellow captives he checked the spread of the disease. Toward the middle of December the Jamaica Merchant dropped anchor in Carlisle Bay, and put ashore the 42 surviving rebels convict. If these unfortunates had imagined, as many of them appeared to have done, that they were coming into some wild, savage country, the prospect of which they had a glimpse before they were hustled over the ship's side into the waiting boats, was enough to correct the impression. They beheld a town of sufficiently imposing proportions, composed of houses built upon European notions of architecture, but without any of the huddle usual in European cities. The spire of a church rose dominantly above the red roofs. A fort guarded the entrance of the wide harbor, with guns thrusting their muzzles between the crenels, and the wide facade of the government house revealed itself dominantly placed on a gentle hill above the town. This hill was vividly green, as is an English hill in April, and the day was such a day as April gives to England, the season of heavy rains being newly ended. On a wide cobbled space on the sea front they found a guard of red-coating militia drawn up to receive them, and a crowd, attracted by their arrival, which in dress and manner differed little from a crowd in the seaport at home, save that it contained fewer women, and with a great number of negroes. To inspect them, Drawn up, there on the mole came Governor Steed, a short, stout, red-faced gentleman in blue taffetas burdened by a prodigious amount of gold lace, who limped a little and leaned heavily upon a stout ebony cane. After him, in the uniform of a colonel of the Barbados militia, rolled a tall, corpulent man who towered head and shoulders above the governor, with malevolence plainly written on his enormous yellowish countenance. At his side, and contrasting oddly with his grossness, moving with an easy stripling grace, came a slight young lady in a modish riding gown. The broad trim of a gray hat, with scarlet sweep of ostrich plumes, shaded an oval face upon which the climate of the Tropic of Cancer had made no impression. So delicately fair was its complexion. Ringlets of red-brown hair hung to her shoulders. Frankness looked out from her hazel eyes, which were set wide. Commiseration repressed now the mischievousness that normally inhabited her fresh young mouth. Peter Blood caught himself staring in a sort of amazement at that piquant face, which seemed here so out of place, and finding his stare returned, he shifted uncomfortably. He grew conscious of the sorry figure that he cut, unwashed, with rank and matted hair, and a disfiguring black beard upon his face, and the erstwhile splendid suit of black camlet in which he had been taken prisoner was now reduced to rags that would have disgraced a scarecrow. He was in no case for inspection by such dainty eyes as these. Nevertheless, they continued to inspect him with round-eyed, almost childlike wonder and pity. Their owner put forth a hand to touch the scarlet sleeve of her companion, whereupon, with an ill-tempered grunt, the man swung his great bulk round so that he directly confronted her. Looking up into his face, she was speaking to him earnestly, but the colonel plainly gave her no more than half of his attention. His little beady eyes, closely flanking a fleshy, pendulous nose, had passed from her and were fixed upon a fair-haired, sturdy young Pitt, who was standing beside Blood. The governor had also come to a halt, and for a moment that little group of three stood in conversation. What the lady said, Peter could not hear at all, for she lowered her voice. The colonel's reached him in a confused rumble, but the governor's was neither considerate nor indistinct. He had a high-pitched voice which carried far, and believing himself witty, he desired to be heard by all. "But, my dear Colonel Bishop, it is for you to take first choice from this dainty nosegay, and at your own price. After that, we'll send the rest to auction." Colonel Bishop nodded his acknowledgment. He raised his voice in answering. "Your Excellency is very good, but, faith, they're a weedy lot, not likely to be of much value in the plantation." His beady eyes scanned them again, and his contempt of them deepened the malevolence of his face. It was as if he were annoyed with them for being in no better condition. Then he beckoned forward Captain Gardner, the master of the Jamaica Merchant, and for some minutes stood in talk with him over a list which the latter produced at his request. Presently he waved aside the list and advanced alone towards the rebel's convict. His eyes considering them, his lips pursed. Before the young Somersetshire shipmaster he came to a halt, and stood an instant pondering him. Then he fingered the muscles of the young man's arm, and bade him open his mouth that he might see his teeth. He pursed his coarse lips again, and nodded. He spoke to Gardner over his shoulder. £15 for this one. Excuse me. The captain made a face of dismay. £15? It isn't half what I meant to ask for him. It's double what I meant to give, grunted the colonel. But he would be cheap at £30, your honor. I can get a Negro for that. These white swine don't live. They're not fit for the labor. Gardner broke into protestations of Pitt's health, youth, and vigor. It was not a man he was discussing. It was a beast of burden. Pitt, a sensitive lad, stood mute and unmoving. Only the ebb and flow of color in his cheeks showed the inward struggle by which he maintained his self-control. Peter Blood was nauseated by the loathsome haggle. In the background, moving slowly away from the line of prisoners, went the lady in conversation with the governor, who smirked and preened himself as he limped beside her. She was unconscious of the loathly business the colonel was transacting. Was she, wondered Blood, indifferent to it? Colonel Bishop swung on his heel to pass on. I'll go as far as £20, not a penny more, and it's twice as much as you're like to get from Crabston. Captain Gardner, recognizing the finality of the tone, sighed and yielded. Already Bishop was moving down the line. For Mr. Blood, as for a weedy youth on his left, the colonel had no more than a glance of contempt. But the next man, a middle-aged colossus named Wolverstone, who had lost an eye at Sedgemoor, drew his regard, and the haggling was recommenced. Peter Blood stood there in the brilliant sunshine and inhaled the fragrant air, which was unlike any air that he had ever breathed. It was laden with a strange perfume, blend of logwood, flower, pimento, and aromatic cedars. He lost himself in unprofitable speculations born of that singular fragrance. He was in no mood for conversation, nor was Pitt, who stood dumbly at his side, and who was afflicted mainly at the moment by the thought that he was at last about to be separated from this man with whom he had stood shoulder to shoulder throughout all these troublous months, and whom he had come to love and depend upon for guidance and sustenance. A sense of loneliness and misery pervaded him, by contrast with which all that he had endured seemed as nothing. To Pitt, this separation was the poignant climax of all of his sufferings. Other buyers came and stared at them and passed on. Blood did not heed them, and then at the end of the line there was a movement. Gardner was speaking in a loud voice, making an announcement to the general public of buyers that had waited until Colonel Bishop had taken his choice of that human merchandise. As he finished, Blood, looking in his direction, noticed that the girl was speaking to Bishop, and pointing up the line with a silver-hilted riding whip she carried. Bishop shaded his eyes with his hands to look in the direction in which she was pointing. Then, slowly, with his ponderous rolling gait, he approached again, accompanied by Gardner, and followed by the lady and the governor. On they came until the colonel was abreast of Blood. He would have passed on. I'm allergic to slavery. And so they came until the colonel was abreast of Blood. He would have passed on, but that the lady tapped his arm with her whip. But this is the man I meant, she said. This one? Contempt rang in the voice. Peter Blood found himself staring into a pair of beady brown eyes sunk into a yellow, fleshly face like currants into a dumpling. He felt the color creeping onto his face under the insult of that contemptuous inspection. Bah! A bag of bones! What should I do with him? He was turning away when Gardner interposed. He may be lean, but he's tough and healthy. When half of them was sick and the other half sickening, this rogue kept his legs and doctored his fellows. But for him, there'd have been more deaths than there was. Say £15 for him, Colonel. That's cheap enough. He's tough, I tell your honor. Tough and strong, though he be lean. And he's just the man to bear the heat when it comes. The climate'll never kill him. There came a chuckle from Governor Steed. You hear, Colonel? Trust your niece. Her sex knows a man when she sees one. And he laughed, well pleased with his wit. But he laughed alone. A cloud of annoyance swept across the face of the colonel's niece, whilst the colonel himself was too absorbed in the consideration of this bargain to heed the governor's humor. He twisted his lip a little, stroking his chin with his hand, the while Jeremy Pitt had almost ceased to breathe. I'll give you £10 for him, said the colonel at last. Peter Blood prayed that the offer might be rejected, for no reason that he could have given you. He was taken with repugnance at the thought of becoming the property of this gross animal, and in some sort of property of that hazel-eyed young girl. But it would need more than repugnance to save him from his destiny. A slave is a slave, and has no power to shape his fate. Peter Blood was sold to Colonel Bishop, a disdainful buyer, for the ignominious sum of £10. And that, my friends, is the conclusion of chapters 3 and 4, really. And we see that our hero is now in Jamaica and soon to work a plantation and has been sold to this colonel. And what will happen in the future? Well, I hope you can join us on Wednesday at 4 p.m., and we will continue by reading chapters 5 and 6, and we will see what happens to Peter Blood from here. Thank you for joining me today. I'm so glad you could make it. I hope you're reading along on your own copy or from Project Gutenberg, and we will see you again in 2 days. Bye, everyone. Take care.